What is up, Internet? Welcome back to Beagle Eye Visions. We're going to do another CubbyWhole episode here and grinding some Titan Quest. This episode number 8 is going to be a very epic one. It is 2 hours long because it features Douglas Martin. He's a very legendary man. He's a very loyal husband. I absolutely love Douglas Martin. I respect the crap out of him. Nothing but extreme reverence that I have for Douglas Martin. So like I said, this is going to be a 2-hour episode, so it's going to be split up in a couple parts. And right now I am in China. I'm in China trying to level up, and then I'll be going back to Egypt to finish this episode off because this episode is called Ancient Egyptian Mythos. So, it just makes sense. So we're going to get started. Welcome!
That's one of the things about religion that we have to remember when we're talking about that makes it such a hot topic issue. It's because we're talking about law. Who gets to be God? Who gets to be God's deputies? Who is the Most High? Who is the divine authority? It's all about the claim to the Most High. The only way that somebody can be higher than us is if we give away our power. Because there's nobody, we're all equal. But we're not equal in our knowledge, so ultimately I think it does have to be a hierarchy, but it has to be a cooperative hierarchy like a bee colony. It's about what our value system is, what we care about.
Hello, Hive Mind. Today is May 26th, 2020. I am your host, Nate Cap. Welcome to the 8th CubbyWhole podcast, where important topics are unveiled, discussed, and tested. Our website is CubbyWhole.com. That's CubbyWhole.com. Today will be a really big dive in the ancient depths type of show. It's a big jump in the past. We have a very special guest who I've been very fortunate to not only be very close to, but also someone who has put in some extreme time into his research. He is a symbolist, independent researcher, author, and public speaker with specialized knowledge in cinematic language and anthropology. And he is currently working on a book and recording his 4th record with his band Resin, a really great band, I might add. Among being a father and grandfather, I know Douglas personally, and I'm forever grateful for his hard work and unveiling the lesser mysteries of the ancient Egyptian mythos. His work can be found right here on the website at CubbyWhole.com under Douglas. Welcome to the show, Douglas Martin.
It's great to be here, Nate Cap. Been really anxious to get on this program. I've been paying attention to your earlier work, and it sounds really good. I like the foundations that are being laid. I've been very anxious to get on here and help extrapolate on some of these arcane ideas to help people get a better understanding of what we're dealing with here, because this is the material that is really getting to the heart of the matter and fleshing out real solutions for the problems that we're faced with in the modern world.
Yeah, I'm really, really excited to have you on the show. And, you and I have some of the most long, deep conversations I've ever had. So I know you're supposed to give your presentation titled Secret Societies Part 2 this Friday at the Seed 4 Growth Conference, which has unfortunately been postponed as a result of the medical tyranny that's taking place. Go ahead and let us know a little bit about your presentation and anything that you have to say about the meaning of seed and the conference.
Yeah, my nephew, Brandon Martin, started the seed events, and this would have been the 4th of the seed events, which I was really, really anxious to be a part of, because not only we were taking it to a higher level by speaking at a university, it was scheduled to take place at the Baker University in Athens, Ohio, but that we had a natural progression in the work And it was a cooperative work in the sense that we were close enough to bring our work together, and all of the work that was brought seemed to complement the other work that was there. And we had such a great lineup of speakers for Seed 4. So I want to think of it in terms of a postponement, because I'm still looking forward to having an opportunity to share the stage with these top caliber speakers, which included Mark Passio as the keynote speaker. And we also had Mark Devlin, who I am a fan of, and Nathan Redette, and I've been paying a lot of attention to his work and been impressed by it. And I knew there was other speakers coming in that had tremendous value to bring to the event. So I'm just going to keep looking forward to actually getting on the stage with these gentlemen and doing it in an academic environment, because my intention is not only to meet the standard of the academic criteria, but even raise the bar, because I want to put emphasis for people that are interested in solutions on scholarship. It does have to go to scholarship. It has to get beyond the conspiracy angle.
Right.
We have to understand how the work is going to be marginalized. We have to anticipate that if our work is genuinely bringing value, that demonstrating the value of the work partly entails meeting the academic standards for criteria and formatting. And it's not that, we all have to be aspiring to be literary geniuses, but we do need to understand words like vulgar, because vulgar typically implies the common tongue or the colloquial tongue. And the elitist, which is typically associated with the ruling class, distinguishes their etiquette from that which is vulgar. And it's not that I'm trying to put political correctness or limitations on speech. It's about taking ourselves seriously in our work. And, I'm not telling anybody that they can't use profanity, or certainly not to refrain from vitriol, but that, like I say, at a certain point, we have to be taking our own work seriously enough to avoid tainting that work with anything that can be used to marginalize the effort. It has to be taken to scholarship, because, part of what I'm trying to teach regarding symbolism is that language represents a degradation of our higher expressions. So while symbolism is generally looked at and is actually, in fact, our earliest expressions, ironically, it represents a more advanced expression of human potential. The idea that Jesus spoke in parables was because he's not trying to riddle us into confusion, per se, but that he understands, or the idea of this entity or this persona was encouraging us to activate the entire brain. Because part of the dilemma of the modern world is a shift into materialism, where we're putting ambition for utility and creature comforts and conveniences above our true spiritual purpose. So I'm thinking of the Robert Anton Wilson quote, "The fear of death is the beginning of slavery." This putting of materialism over spiritual purpose is leading us into a materialistic world where our value systems become corrupted. Because ideally, the only way we're going to really flesh out the solutions is when we get these things prioritized and get principles back in order. And principles meaning first things. That which has to come first. Our foundations are most important. So, wanted to just say a little bit more about that. This is, associated with the idea in the Egyptian tradition that when the soul passes on beyond the mortal existence, it's not considered a mort or a dissolution. the being. It's just a transference of energy and a continuation of a never-ending journey in the face of eternity. It's not a dissolution, and they called that westing, and that is associated with the sun setting in the west as it goes below the horizon. And it's no irony that our modern world is basically based on what we call Western civilization ideals. Now, there is a distinction to make between the modern world in the East and Western civilization, but we have to understand how Western civilization has also spread into the East and influences the Eastern world in the modern world. So we have to associate or understand what these ideas regarding Western civilization are and put that in context of the idea of westing. It's the chasing of the lost city of El Dorado, the alchemical allegory for the lost city of gold. The idea of the man that would be king. We came for the gold, but we stayed for the adventure. And that pertains to the idea that, you know, we went on a spiritual journey to discover true spiritual purpose and then discovered physical gold. And even that didn't satisfy us. We were only satisfied when the indigenous people of that world would worship us as gods, and then we would stay and enjoy our reign as king, and revered by the indigenous people as gods. It's a corruption of the spiritual destiny. It's very, you know, there's a very profound allegory of that in the Rudyard Kipling, The Man That Would Be King, and it's also a great film based on that story. It's a very Masonic allegory, but also
Very great book and very great movie.
also associated with the alchemical aspect of what we would call craft masonry. In that sense, it's really coming more from Neoplatonism, because I associate alchemy as the later stages, you know, the more in perspective of how much time the Egyptian mythos has actually evolved. It's very late in the game. So, you know, from my point of view, Neoplatonism is contemporary. So I want to make sure and explain that. You know, this is after the time of Plato. And basically during the Hellenistic period of Greece. You see, one of the important things to understand when you're studying history, for instance, is to pay attention to where the learning is taking place. So when we pick up history in academia, we find that they're springboarding off of prehistory, which is apparently so ambiguous that no scholars agree on it. So somehow, beginning with Homer, we have enough consensus continuity in academia where we can agree that this is where history picks up, and we can start to nail it down in terms of times and places and people that made significant achievements that we can document and start building this timeline. So it's important to pay attention to where the learning is taking place. So when we pick up history, we want to pay attention to the fact that the learning is taking place in what's considered to be Hellenic Greece. And that's based on the Greek mythology and the works of Homer in terms of the ideals that are popular and proliferated, create the pinnacle of the Greek civilization. And then as it starts to decline in the post-Plato and the post-Plato and Socrates eras, it becomes known as Hellenistic Greece, and that represents a decline in that era. And then the moving from that point, or the learning from that point, moves back to Alexandria, which is the delta of the Nile Valley in northern Egypt. So that's what's very important to understand, because the learning goes from Greece and Athens, Greece, back to Alexandria, and then simultaneously you have the rise of the Roman Republic. This is all happening between 500 BC and then the time of Augustus. The rise and then the ultimate decline and fall of the Roman Republic with the death, or, the rise of Julius Caesar, and then the death of Julius Caesar, and then the rise of Augustus. And at that point, that basically constitutes the end of the Roman Republic and the rise of the Roman Empire. And at that time, in 31 BC, Alexandria is sacked and the library is burned in Alexandria. So the learning has now moved, from Hellenic Greece, declining into Hellenistic Greece, and then moving back to Alexandria. That's the time of Neoplatonism, where the scholarship is endeavoring to recover as much of the knowledge that they can. So we have to understand that the real knowledge base was always Egypt. And everything that was outside of Egypt was basically misinterpretations and misgivings about what the real pure sciences of the Egyptians were. And part of the reason for that is because of the expression. And, we're back to symbolism and sign language. So, the Hebrews took from Babylon what was already a corrupted Egyptian and gave us the Pentateuchs.
Hold on real quick. What is sign language?
Well, it's similar. It's not the same as for the hearing impaired, but it's basically, ritual, gesture, including phonetics. But when we think of phonetics in the very ancient world, we're thinking of monosyllabic expressions of phonetics, and including the mimicking of the animal world. They're mimicking animal sounds. I mean, our earliest sounds are based on animal sounds. And like a snake that hisses is where we derive the letter S. That's an important foundation to start with. But, one of the differences between the ancient tongue and modern tongue is that the vowel, that's very important to understand, the vowels invoke the spirit. And in that respect, the vowels are interchangeable, so only the consonants actually define what is in the physical world. And so Kemet, which is ancient Egypt, is KMT. And in that respect, we can give an example. Amen is no different than Oman or Imon or that's just an example. So Amen is the same as Omen or Oman or Imon. So we just have to understand that the consonants are invoking the physical aspects, while the vowels, which basically are a set of 7. I mean, we need to understand the vowels in a term of 7. So the idea of that was the tetragrammaton, or the enunciation, is better said, of the Creator. The Creator can't be defined, so we can't put a label on it, was the idea, but that the vowels invoked the Spirit, and they're a set of 7, which is A, E, I, O, U, and then W and Y. And these are the vowels. So this is no irony why Yahweh, from the Hebrew tetragrammaton, is spoken in the way that it is and spelled the way that it is. Because it's just a way to invoke the Spirit. It's an idea to refer to the Spirit without defining the Spirit. It's an invocation of the Spirit. And this is the vowels. So very important to understand, and very important to understand that it's associated with this number 7. Because the number 7 is the foundations of what I'm going to call the lesser mysteries. See, I don't want to hold back. I am trying to make this accessible to laity, but at the same time, it needs to be spoken as directly as possible and then hopefully we'll have time to continue to come in and lay the groundwork to make it as accessible to laity as possible.
It's very interesting stuff. I really like your whole take on trying to find the ideas through history, and that's something that's really inspired me to want to get into history more, because I know history is just like, it's very overwhelming, and you don't really know where to go and, you know, what to look for. And I think that you've done a really good job at putting the groundwork out there for people to grasp that idea.
We have to pay attention to that. In academia and scholarship, what we find is that people can have a lot of knowledge and somehow be lacking the understanding. And it's associated with the idea of developing a strong memory. So this is part of the dilemma of modern education, is emphasis putting on memorizing and regurgitating, which supports the idea that truth comes from authority, rather than something that needs to be discovered on a personal level using the truth discovery methods, which I hope to get into, but let me just mention them real quick here. The truth discovery methods are the trivium, the quadrivium, which make up the liberal arts, apophasis, which is affirmation through negation, and the Hegelian dialectic, which is where we take two sides and then synthesize that into one harmonious compound. And of course, there is corrupted applications for all of these things. But we need to understand them in their pure forms. You know, because the idea of the Gnostics was that the Gnostics, they had doctrines that are similar to modern religion, but in the Gnostic methods, you were given the tools for you to forge the relationship between your creator without the authority. You know, but you're not going to have something that you don't earn. If we want truth, we must labor for it quite as hard as we labor for gold. Those that associate with sensuals cannot associate with spirituals. You know, but about, you know, where the learning is taking place is what you want to pay attention to when you study history. So when Rome sacks Alexandria, they're bringing all of the learning to Rome. And then, you know, they're basically beginning to understand that they're going to need a new doctrine to unite everybody under the banner of Roman pragmatism, which became modern, what we know as Christianity in the modern world. So let me just, you know, because this is one of the very important points that I was hoping to make at Seed 4. And my presentation for Seed 4 was entitled Secret Societies Part 2, The Cult of Osiris and the Mingling of the Mythology with the Perfected Eschatology. Because the eschatology was perfected in the cult of Osiris. And that actually happened 50,000 years ago in the solar cult. And the solar cult is 100,000 years old. So that is right, basically, dead center of the solar cult, 50,000 years ago. So what does it mean, the perfected eschatology? It means that every doctrine regarding eschatology, and eschatology just means final things, every doctrine in the wake of the perfected eschatology is inferior. That's what it means. So it means that at that point of the perfected eschatology begins a decline. And that decline is a result of negligence. And it's still a process where the evolution is evolving, because the pinnacle of that evolution is Christianity. But see, Christianity in its modern forms is degraded in the way that it's been literalized and historicized. So in that way, we've lost the pure teaching. And I'd like to give you a Gerald Massey quote right here to help drive this point home. Regarding mythology, Massey states, quote, "There is nothing insane, nothing irrational in it. The insanity lies in mistaking it for human history or divine revelation." So mistaking the mythology for human history or divine revelation is at the crux of the problem. Mythology is the depository for man's most ancient science. And what concerns us chiefly is this: when truly interpreted once more, it is destined to be the death of the false theologies to which it has unwittingly given birth. And I'd like to read that again just to smooth it out a little bit. Mythology is the depository for man's most ancient science, and what concerns us chiefly is this. When truly interpreted once more, it is destined to be the death of those false theologies to which it has unwittingly given birth. And that's Gerald Massey.
Like that.
So that's what we're talking about here. So in order to flesh out the dogma that resulted in this declining, because see, the degradation of the solar cult corresponds to a continued evolution of this mythology, or what we call the mythos. So the solar cult has been in existence for 100,000 years, but for the last 50,000 years, it's been declining radically into a historicized account, and also the anthropomorphization of the ideographic types is largely responsible for that. So I want to give you a Jesse L. Weston quote with regard to that. Any religion with a fully anthropomorphized monotheistic deity is a ritual in an advanced form. What that means is that the ideographic types, which began as representing these abstract ideas by things, what Harold Bailey calls the art of thinging, expression of abstract ideas by associating with things, begins with zootypes to represent elemental powers and unseen forces in nature. That which represented the things that were divine were far removed from human qualities or human characteristics. It's when we began adding the human characteristics that they began to be degraded. And then once they became fully personified or anthropomorphized, what was originally intended to represent that which was divine and that which was unseen, and these unseen elemental powers in nature, that which was divine was no longer represented by a thing that represented something divine. So while we can think of the human being as creation's highest expression, it's the responsibility of the individual to unfold its highest potential. So we all have the capacity, but see, humans are flawed, and that which is divine is not flawed. It's perfect in every way, and the laws that it has woven into creation are perfect in every way. So when we try to represent something that's perfect in every way with something that is flawed, we begin to degrade the significance of that which is divine. So fully anthropomorphized, we've really degraded a standard of a representation of that which is divine. And that's not an easy thing to say. You know, what we think of as Christianity had a place in the pre-Christian world, and in many different forms with many different names for the same concept of the deity. And this idea, for instance, of salvationism, it's a solar doctrine, so it's based on the return of the king, which is the sun. Because, you know, the mythology came from hero cults. And before they were hero cults, they were evolved into hero cults from all the way back to the totemic sociology. So, you know, from totemic sociology evolves in what became the first of the hero cults, which was stellar, meaning they venerated into the stars, primarily southern circumpolar constellations, then brought into northern circumpolar constellations. Then changed into venerating in lunar cycles. And that was a schism or a point of contention, because we're changing from venerating in the great year cycle of the circumpolar constellations in the south and then going into the north into annual cycles, and then venerating in constellations east to west, west to east. And I know that sounds like a head full and a mouthful, and it is, but then from lunar we went into solar doctrines. And as the mythology evolved through those stages, it's changing types of expressions. And then only in the solar cult, and well into the solar cult, did they not only change from divinizing the motherhood to divinizing the fatherhood. So the fatherhood was never divinized until solar cult, and not divinized even in the first 30,000 years of the solar cult. It was still venerated in the motherhood and in the night sky. It only happened in the cult of Amen-Ra, which started roughly 80,000 years ago, that they began to venerate in day sky and then divinizing the fatherhood. I'm trying not to get too much into that right now because we're really plunging in head first.
Yeah, no, it's a lot to unravel in just a short amount of time. I wanted to know what is totemic sociology, and also how can you know how long ago these cults started?
It's a legitimate question, and it's part of the way academia and quote unquote scholars discount the information. We're not going to have something that we don't earn, and we're looking for the physical evidence. But the problem with that and the problem with empiricism is we're digging up things in the dirt that we don't understand. And then we're using what we call quote unquote scientific method to try and date these things with carbon dating and not understanding the limitations of these types of methods. It's only by understanding the culture, which by understanding the culture, we understand what they care about, therefore we understand what they're endeavoring to do. And then when we start digging in the dirt, we can get a better understanding of what we're actually discovering as we dig down into the layers of the strata. So if we're digging in the dirt without the knowledge, we're going to the information without the knowledge. And therefore, we have no way to orientate and understand how this evolution and the evidence for this evolution is actually taking place. Now, that's not to say that there is not empirical evidence, because there is, and there is osteoanatomy to be found that demonstrates, for instance, evolving sizes of the cranium. But that's primarily in the Nile Valley where we're going to find that. We have to understand that there's special interests in the world that don't want that understood. They want to give us a tiny box of this 5,000 or 6,000 year history. And as long as we're in that box, we're never going to be able to fit the truth into that box, because we're talking about, we need to be working with a 500,000 to 600,000 year history, and quite frankly, a couple of million years forward. But, what we're talking about is the beginnings of the evolution of human mental processes, the point at which man recognizes his ability to reason and then begins to apply his ability to reason. So what this all amounts to is that our religious ideas actually became the foundations of our earliest human mental processes. The idea that we have a culture that recognizes its ability to reason and recognizes that it is not just the physical body, but that there's a life force in the body that is eternal, and evidence that they believe in one great spirit, and began to practice certain behaviors that we can find evidence that they've left behind, that they are demonstrating behaviors that show us that they had this belief. So what I'm trying to say is the earliest religious ideas are the beginnings of the evolution of our human mental processes. And there's a natural chronology, there's a natural order of things, which means that which comes later couldn't have happened without that which came before. So there's a natural order to the evolution of these human mental processes. So most people hear the word evolution, they immediately jump to the idea of Darwinism. We're not talking about Darwinistic evolution, nor are we talking about what I want to call autonomous evolution, which is the evolution of species on Earth before man begins to evolve on his own, his capacity for reasoning in human mental processes. So at the beginning of the early totemic sociology, they began taking behaviors that there's evidence for. And there's cultures still in the world today that still demonstrate these same behaviors. In fact, every stage of human evolution in all its phases is still extant in the world today. And, that's a very controversial thing to say. And we have to be careful when we tread on this ground. So the main thing I would want to put emphasis on this is that we're not disconnected. We're not separated. but only by tuning into the higher frequencies and accessing the unused parts of our brain, typically what we would consider to be right brain that deals with the abstract unseen, are we going to be able to develop perception where we perceive the things that these empirical scientists and archaeologists and anthropologists have all failed to understand because they went to the information without enough knowledge. They went unprepared. So the same things that they had the tendency to overlook were the same things that their contemporaries have overlooked. So what we have in science is a consensus, and a consensus, bias. But if we can flesh this out, we can show that, ultimately in the universities, we're teaching religion in the sense of dogma.
You speak of, since we're on the topic of evolution, you speak of, weaponry, the evolution of weaponry and ritual in these, in the mythos or these hero cults. Why is that so important to pay attention to, or to, why is it important to understand?
When we get into the archaeology and the anthropology, what we find is that we're looking for osteoanatomy evidence, which means they want to dig up skeletons that show inferior phases of the shape of the skull, lesser sizes of the shape of the skull, what we think of Neanderthal man. Part of understanding it is understanding what the dangers of Darwinism are. Why the status quo would want us to have a certain worldview regarding origins and how that would benefit them. For one thing, they want to drive us into the arms of the authorities and teach us that truth comes from authority. But see, these are not easy subjects, and they're very difficult questions to address. I expect that as you continue your podcast series, I'll be able to hopefully keep coming back onto the show, and we can keep getting into the same material until we can flesh it out enough to really give you the answers. Because
definitely,
I don't want to. A lot of what we've already discussed sounds unfinished, and it is. And part of we got to understand is that we're limited in our understanding by words. Because, like I say, my ambition is to teach the higher expressions, which are form and symbol. So we have to understand how words constitute a degradation of our higher capacities to express and understand. So we're limited in our understanding by words. Part of the befuddlement or the stultification of the modern academic world is they've lost touch with these ancient expressions and these sublime, arcane knowledge. The expression is obscured, and I want to finish what I was saying. The Hebrews took from Babylon what was already a corrupted Egyptian and gave us the Pentateuch. And that's not just a corrupted Egyptian, but it's also a corrupted Egyptian in the solar phase. But the Greeks so the Hebrews took from the Babylons what was already a corrupted Egyptian and gave us the Pentateuch. And they never understood the Egyptian sign language. And then the Greeks never understood the Egyptian sign language. And their perversions of it were taken by the Romans, which classical scholars have taken and perpetuated into the modern world. So this befuddlement is nothing new. The books that are in the Bible, the scriptures, we have to understand, number one, yes, they are very politically biased. There's plenty in there that has nothing to do with spirituality. And we also have to understand that the real ancient mysteries and the ancient teachings never existed in a textual form. So academia and archaeology and anthropology are discounting ancient expressions which they never understood in the first place. So they're only going to give credence to something that is in a form of text, and that's very contemporary in terms of how long and how old this wisdom is, because the purest forms of this never existed in a textual form. They have the same dilemma that the Greeks had. They never understood the Egyptian sign language. They never understood the Egyptian expression of symbolism and sign language. So we have to keep that in mind. And another thing I want to say here that we have to keep in mind is that all new religions endeavor to obliterate all traces of their predecessors. So why is that? Why do we find that phenomena of the solar evolution of the, particularly in the solar cult is where we find this happening the most. So what we find is the solar cults gridding or fleshing out the hallowed ground of the stellar and lunar phases of the mythos and finding or gridding out their hallowed ground and then destroying their temples and trying to build their and the solar temples on top of it. And that actually comes all the way into the last eon before the rise of Rome and Christianity. We still find there's evidence that that's what's taking place, but we have to also understand that the stellar mythos at that point in time is stagnated. We still have men dedicated to the service of the stellar mythos, but because their mythos had been driven out of the Nile Valley, the remnants of it were carried by what we would call the caravans that were sent out, what we might think in the modern world or call or identify with as the Druids. These represented roving secret societies that were keepers of ancient wisdom, but we got to put that in perspective of how much time that they had been, how long ago they were driven out of the Nile Valley where the sanctuary was, where the mythos could be evolved, and that they were just keeping as much of the symbolism intact, which became vestigial over time. We have to understand that the ability to rediscover the pure meanings of the symbolism that was kept intact, that became vestigial. We have to understand that, the possibility to rediscover it is because it was so meticulously preserved in the way that it was preserved. So even though it has become vestigial, it is possible to flesh that out now. But quite frankly, there was a period of nescience. And I want to say that, it's only been within the last 100 years that it's actually possible to take what the secret societies managed to preserve into the modern world and put it all back together to where it can actually be rediscovered and reinterpreted correctly and understood. That's only been possible for the last 100 years, and it's largely due to J. Norman Lockyer's work, for which is paved the way for Gerald Massey, and then ultimately Albert Churchward and Alvin Boyd Kuhn and Manly P. Hall, which I pretty much consider to be the most important authors of our times. And I don't want to forget to mention Jesse L. Weston.
I'd have to corroborate that for the most part. I haven't really researched all their work enough, but from what I have researched, I definitely can see how important their work really is.
Well, we're just starting to scratch the surface, because part of understanding this is the idea that we can't serve two masters is that we all have the capacity to unlock these deeper expressions in our ability to decode the sublime information from the environment. But see, again, the limitations of the quote-unquote scholars is that they're looking at the same information with the same level of consciousness, not able to perceive or receive the sublime information that's available right before our very eyes. So we have to understand symbolism. See, symbolism is the key. But how do we understand symbolism and what's causing it? What is making it such a difficult thing to do? Part of it is we're talking about unused part of our brain. So the only way that we're going to be able to really perceive this sublime arcane information is to find ways to re-strengthen those unused atrophied areas of the brain. So when somebody is looking for instant gratification and wanting somebody to tell them exactly what it is and then walking away dissatisfied with the explanation they were given, it's because no one can do their work for them. If they want to really know, they're going to have to labor for it quite as hard as they labor for gold. And at the risk of sounding arrogant, which isn't a bad thing, because I can never humble myself to the point where I would tell you something I don't know something that I do. is that the only way that this is possible is to strengthen these atrophied areas of the brain, which is typically associated with right brain, because Western idealism and Western ambitions are based on utility, materialism over spiritual purpose. So this is a big part of the schism, this Roman pragmatism. In the big picture of things, we're selling our soul for creature comforts. So it's no irony that we see people today hoarding toilet paper, because toilet paper is the perfect archetype of creature comforts. And when it comes down to it, we're selling our soul for creature comforts. And it's associated with materialism. The idea of T.S. Eliot's not with a bang, but with a whimper. The idea that man relinquishes his freedom and his soul without even fighting back and just rolls over. That's, not with a bang, but with a whimper. I want to back up a little bit. These are difficult subjects. So part of us being able to make progress with these subjects is to learn to be honest with ourselves. And the process of learning being honest with ourselves is a matter of understanding we're talking about not only esoteric wisdom. It's esoteric in the sense of the modern world, that we're in a post-apocalyptic world where the knowledge has been revealed, or it's now possible to access the knowledge, but it's still esoteric knowledge. So we have to understand that not only was there a long period of time where there was actually nescience, but that the knowledge that was available had become occulted. So the ruling, corrupted priest classes were at a certain point holding that knowledge back from the masses. And they still had at least a big enough piece of the mythology that was potent, but that more and more it became corrupted, the more they wanted to use that to control people by holding back the tools that we need to flesh out the deeper understanding. So we're also talking about occultism, which means that which was hidden. But see, the occultism in the not so distant world and all the way into the remote ancient world, it was a result of a deterioration and ultimately a corruption and a deliberate perversion of the pure mythology, and also how language exchanged the expressions of pure symbolism in sign language. There's a lot to this, so just trying to, there's a few things I want to make sure and say. Okay, so one of the things I want to say is that part of the thesis for the presentation I had coming up was to explain the role of the secret societies, and that each stage of the evolution of the mythos, when a significant change might occur in the mythos, they would send out caravans to spread the knowledge out all over the world. But when the caravans leave the sanctuary of the Nile Valley, whatever they take with them at that phase of the evolution begins to stagnate. So the evolution is only occurring in the Nile Valley where the sanctuary is. So as it spread out all over the world, wherever it settled, it already was going into a stagnated phase. Now, over long periods of time, epochs, they kept some of the symbolism intact that managed to make it into the modern world through their endeavors and their efforts, but it did not evolve from that point. So whatever phase that we're finding it outside of the Nile Valley, we have to understand that that represents a stagnated phase of that evolution of the mythos. So when we start digging in the dirt, we're going to have a much better idea of what we're dealing with. That's one of the points I wanted to make, but we have to understand in the pre-Christian world that this idea that Christianity was born out of already existed under different nomenclature throughout the entire Fertile Crescent and beyond into the East and the Indus Valley and, quite frankly, all over Europe. We have to understand that the secret societies played a very vital function in those times. And the function of the secret societies were a continuation of your general education. So when you completed your general education of your curriculum, you were expected to come out of your school, or what you might call your university, and then go into a secret society. We understand now, the big universities, they have the secret societies, but these are corrupted, at least have the potential to have been corrupted. And we have to understand, as soon as a secret society becomes above ground, above sub rosa, it's immediately infiltrated by special interests. And what is a special interest going to do? It's going to go in there, it's going to pervert the method and the teaching, and then bring that out into the light of day to marginalize the function of the secret society. So I want to just be able to say this a certain way. Secret societies were a vital function in the pre-Christian world, and their role was to, or it was expected of the student once he completed his general educations to go out and join a secret society. But before being accepted into the secret society, he first had to choose an exoteric faith, what we think of as modern religion. So because that was a prerequisite requirement, he couldn't be taken into the secret society until he chose his exoteric faith, upon which he could be taken and initiated into the secret society, where he would receive the tools that would allow him to flesh out the true meaning of the exoteric religion or the exoteric doctrine, and then learn and receive the esoteric meaning of the exoteric doctrine. So we have to understand, and I want to make sure that that comes through, if nothing else, on this podcast, because that was a big part of the thesis of my presentation that I was going to give at the Baker University in Athens, which I still am going to give, and hopefully start getting some better platforms to present this material. Ultimately, I wanted to trace it forward from the cult of Osiris all the way into the Christian world, and then bring that all the way up into the modern world, or the rise of Christianity into the modern world. So we have to understand that this idea of Christianity existed before what happened in Rome. It existed before the Roman Church. So what the Roman Church did effectively was that they packaged and labeled the exoteric religion and then went to war on the secret societies. Because the secret societies, remember, were the necessary vital function of the society, where you could go first choosing your exoteric faith and then go into, because see, even in modern Masonry, they accept all faiths. Whatever your book of faith is, they welcome into that society. Then they want to give you the tools to flesh out the deeper esoteric meaning of your exoteric faith, or your exoteric religion, or your exoteric doctrine. But without those tools, that's not really possible. So why is that? And, I didn't try to avoid your question, but see, this is what we're getting to. What are these tools? We have to understand that the ancients spiritualized everything, so that every new discovery of knowledge was sacred. So what they were endeavoring to do was find ways to preserve that knowledge. So they spiritualized it. Every new discovery was sacred. What did that mean? It meant that it had to be put into a stage of repetition where it can't get lost, and that it was there to serve us to gain a better understanding of truth, which corresponds to the one great spirit. The closer we get to the science of causes, puts us in direct proximity with our Creator. So by the idea of forming a relationship with our Creator has to be earned, because it's about learning a science of causality. So the more we understand causality, the closer proximity we're coming to our Creator, the cause of causes. So the idea is that they spiritualized everything, and became sacred. So this idea of worship, it's a corrupted idea, because it came from repetition of ritual. And the idea of repetition of ritual was the method of preserving the knowledge and making sure it got passed forward to the new generations. In a vestigial form, we would call that worship, because that's what worship is. It's like externalizing our faith instead of internalizing our work. So worship in itself, that term, it represents a corruption of ritual, which represents a repetition as a vital function to pass knowledge forward, and constitutes an increase of understanding, an increase in our learning. So what I'm trying to say is, by spiritualizing the tools or the implementation, in the implementation, we find the evolution. In other words, I want to say, starting with acts, when we have stone on the stick, what we might call hammer, axe, was better to associate and understand with axe. We're hafting stone onto stick. I'm trying not to go directly into that because it's a big topic. But just, you know, from our first earliest implementation forward, we know axe or hammer came before bow. And, you know, we know that hafting stone on the stick came before metallurgy. And then we know that we can't have sword or blade until we have the metallurgy. So that's where we find this evidence of this evolution in the implementation. I'm trying to respond to your question. So it's in the implementation, and then after we have metallurgy and sword, and we, you know, I'm trying to avoid terms like Bronze Age, Iron Age, because those bolster the ideas of the Yuga cycles and gives us a distorted vision of what the evolution is really about. But just pay attention to the implementation. So after sword, ultimately we come to gunpowder. And then following gunpowder, we find improvements in applications of gunpowder, and then ultimately projectile weaponry, and then into the modern age of technology, which is just it's beyond our wildest imagination now what the technology for weaponry specifically can be. But, you know, particularly want to use the term implementation. So we'll back up a little bit with this. The tools that you would be given in the mystery schools to flesh out the meaning of your exoteric faith and understand the esoteric understanding of the faith. You want to think of it in terms of learning a science.
So I made it to the village of Sais. I think we're going to stop there. That's a good stopping point before the PlayStation cuts me off. Yeah, like I said, Douglas Martin is an absolute legend. His knowledge is very extensive and very deep. I would definitely recommend looking more into his work. He is another content creator on the O.GWork network.com, I believe. I'll leave a link in the description of this video. Yeah, man, check out his work. It's good stuff, really good stuff. I'm going to take a smoke break and then upload this, and I'll probably keep going. But I also have to learn Raining Blood by Slayer on guitar today. So I have a tall task ahead of me, and I need to accomplish that tall task before Sunday. But now I'm going off on a tangent. All right, thanks for sticking around if you made it this far. We will finish this episode off. This episode has about an hour, a little bit over an hour left to go, and we will dive more into the ancient Egyptian mythos. So thanks for sticking around. Stay tuned.